Peace be with you. Friends, can I begin this sermon with some of the most disturbing words in the New Testament? Listen to this now from the Gospel of Luke. If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. There they are, words, of course, out of the mouth of Jesus, talking to his disciples about the cost of discipleship. Anyone comes to me without hating those who are closest to him. Now, here's the same person that told us to love our enemies, bless those who curse us, pray for those who maltreat us. So we love our enemies and we hate our family members. That's what he's telling us. Well, this sounds like a pretty odd religion, doesn't it? And we can't get around this by saying, well, what he means here is, unless you turn your back on your family, unless you leave them aside. The Greek word used is miseo, which means to hate. When you talk about a misogynist, someone that hates women, or a misanthrope, someone that hates human beings, unless you hate them. Well, what does this mean? As usual, the Gospel of Luke makes us squirm, especially in this section when Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship. This gospel makes us very uneasy. It's meant to bring you up short, make you wonder, make you ask. Here's a way I think of getting at it. If we cut to the end of this reading for today, Jesus says, in the same way, any one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. That, I think, is the key to the passage. Is he telling us straightforwardly to hate our family? Well, no. This is the Jesus who calls for compassion, as we said, even to the enemy. But we must indeed hate mother, father, brother, sister, children in the measure that they have become our possessions. Possession, attachment, as I've often said, is a key motif in the Gospels. Until you get rid of your attachments, you're not worthy of discipleship. Let me illumine this from another angle. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." The key to Christian morality is always theology. By that I mean we are meant to imitate God. Christian morality is not just a matter of being ethically upright, doing the right thing. It is that, but it means so much more. It means being like unto God, perfect as God is perfect. What characterizes God's perfection? God has no possessions. Let me say that again. It's the one thing I want you to remember from this talk. God has no possessions. Look, in our great doctrine of the Trinity, the Father does nothing other than give himself away to the Son. The Son, from all eternity, does nothing other than give himself away back to the Father. The Spirit, the mutual self-giving of the Father and the Son. God is not a being hoarding perfections and possessions. Rather, God, by his very nature, gives himself away. God is generosity, or in the language of John, God is love. That's not something that God does, it's what God is, it's who God is. Now, how does this Trinitarian God relate to the world? I find this terrifically important, not just as a theological clarification, but as something of great moment in the Christian spiritual life. God does not possess the world. Why? because God doesn't need the world. God needs nothing. God requires nothing. In God's perfection, God requires nothing outside of himself. Therefore, when God makes the world, it is in a sheerly generous act of love. Listen, just as the Trinitarian persons give themselves away, so God gives himself away in sheerly generous love, and that's why the world exists. The world is not there for God to possess as though it's something he needs to boost up his ego, to shore up his fragile sense of identity. God needs nothing. Therefore, the world can be fully itself and is not something manipulated and dominated by a needy God. You know, there's a trend going on now that really bothers me. And you'll see it in all kinds of books in spirituality in the New Age. It's a recovery of the pagan gods and goddesses. They'll talk about the gods and goddesses within. They'll talk about recovering the beauty of the ancient myths and so on. Well, there is beauty in the ancient mythology. But, when you read those stories carefully, what do you find? Those gods and goddesses, at the end of the day, they used the world for their own pleasure and their own purposes. They were not in a relationship of sheer generosity toward the human race. On the contrary, when you read those stories carefully, you'll see that time after time, the gods and goddesses use us for their own purposes. We become their possessions. It is precisely the opposite in the biblical tradition. God does not need us. And listen, Christians, that is remarkably good news. I know it sounds a little bit shocking at first, but it's remarkably good news that God doesn't need us. That means God can let us be. Allow us to flourish on our own terms without being manipulated and dominated for his own purposes. Another way to look at it, as Georges Bernanos said, the great French novelist, tout est grâce. Everything is grace. Grace. The world exists not because God needs it, but because God gives it away as a gift. That's all what grace means, gratia. It's given freely as a gift. Everything we have, our being, our bodies, our senses, our powers, our passions, every breath that we draw, every step that we take, all of it is a grâce. It's a gift. It's a grace given to us by a generous God. Now, what's our response to all this? We must not turn the world around us into our possession. That's the spiritual danger. Rather, what we've received as a gift, we should give as a gift. What's been given as a gift, we should appreciate as a gift. One of the marks of sin is that we turn the gracious world around us into our possession. It usually comes from fear. I'm afraid. I'm threatened, I'm going to lose myself, I'm going to be overwhelmed. So what do? I shore up my fragile identity with all kinds of possessions. Yes, material things, TVs and cars and so on, but also things like titles and degrees and status and the esteem of others. I make of all of these things my possessions. Now, push it to the furthest point. I also make of the people around me my possessions. Yes, even those who are closest to me and whom I ought to love with the sheerest love. Mother, father, sister, brother, children. I make of them my possessions. You know what I'm talking about? Those moments when we realize that in our sin, we are the star of a drama. And everyone around us, even those closest to us, are simply supporting players in that drama. They're serving my needs. I'm acting out my purposes through them. I am finding pleasure by using them. That's what I mean by making a possession of people around me. You know, of course, the most obvious example, and people talk about it a lot, parents who live vicariously through their kids. Their child is not there to flourish on her own, but the child becomes a way that the parents live out the life they never lived. It works, of course, the other way. I mean, watch any little child. They just do it naturally. They use their parents to fulfill their needs. But sometimes we never grow out of this, and suddenly we're 35 and 40 years old, and we're still using our parents to work out our own needs, to compensate for our own problems. Brothers can manipulate brothers. Sisters manipulate sisters. Friends can use each other for their purposes. Christians, this is what Jesus means, I think, when he says, get rid of all these people in the measure that they have become your possessions. In other words, break this tendency to make of them your possessions. Here's a lovely quote from Emmanuel Levinas. He's a Jewish philosopher, writes in French, and he's a favorite of the Pope. John Paul II often invited him to Castel Gandolfo to give papers and so on. But Levinas said this, it's a pun in French, tout autre est tout autre, which means every other is totally other. Every other is totally other. I think what he means is this. When another person confronts you, your job is to love that person for his or her own sake, willing what is for their good. The tendency of sin is to forget this fact and to say, your purpose here is to serve my needs. Therefore, listen, I will draw you in to the black hole of my own egotism, so that you don't have a life and mind and will of your own, but now they're drawn in for my purposes. Tout autre est tout autre. Every other is totally other. St. Augustine said, to love is to will the good of the other as other, not as a function of my personal game. This, I think, is what Jesus is talking about. He's telling us that the life we lead should be like unto the life of God. When God creates, he lets the world be, so that on its own terms it can find its own beauty and goodness and truth. God clears the space so that we might be. So Christians, as we relate to the world around us, we must be like God, living not in possessiveness, not in fear, but in an attitude of creative love, letting the other be. Jesus says, unless you have this in you, this lack of possessiveness, you will never even get the Christian project off the ground. Just as someone who wants to build a tower, but doesn't consider what he needs to make this project possible, so the person who says, I want to live the life of discipleship, but I'm surrounded by possessions, especially the people that I've made possessions, that person will never get the Christian life off the ground. If you love somebody, set them free in creative love. God bless. Peace be with you. Friends, today we continue with this startling, disturbing, surprising discourse that Jesus offers to his apostles just before he sends them out. It's from the 10th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and it's a wonderful thing to meditate on for any Christian. Sit down and read this chapter and let its demand sink in. Because the thing that you find about it is it's just unrelenting. There's something intense and almost unforgiving about it, what Jesus demands of his disciples. Last week we heard it. Fear no one. Fear no one. Anyone that can just kill the body and do nothing else. Well, those are our greatest fears, people that can harm our bodies. Jesus says, don't worry about them. Don't fear them. but fear only God, who can kill both body and soul. That means a radical reorientation of our lives. Well, it continues this week. Just maybe when we want a little moderation, a little cooling off, Jesus, in fact, turns up the heat. Listen to what he says. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Well, you're tempted to say, come again? Is there anything more demanding or uncompromising than this? Think of the love of a child for his parents. Think of the love of a parent for his or her children. Is there any love that is more intense, more absolute, more demanding than those? First of all, think of them in terms of the interiority of feeling. Is there any feeling more intense than that, let's say, of a child for his parents? You know, the fear a child will feel if the parents are missing, if they're gone too long. The fear that haunts a child that his parents might die. The intensity of that relationship. And how it continues often through life. Well into one's adulthood, there's a passionate connection between a person and his mother or father. And then flip it the other way. The intensity of feeling that a parent has for a child. There's a friend of mine who was a pretty happy-go-lucky guy when he was a teenager in his early 20s. Lived life pretty much on his own terms for his own pleasure and so on. Then he got married and he had a child, a little girl. And I remember the day he came to me and said, you know, somehow now my whole life is different. Because I realized that I would happily die to protect this child. I think a lot of parents witness to that. Something happens when you realize, my life is not about me. Now it's about this child. A parent gets connected to a son or a daughter in this passionate way, where yes, I'd even give my life to protect you. I think if my father or my mother, they would easily say that, without hesitation, that they would give their lives for their kids. So what's Jesus saying? Unless you love me more intensely than you love a parent, more intensely than you love a child, you're not worthy of me. You're not worthy to be my disciple. Now think of those loves in terms of external obligations. Because you love your parents, you have a whole set of obligations to them. To spend time with them, if necessary to provide them money, to protect them, care for them as they get older. You know, if there was a parent who was neglected by an adult child, we'd say, well, there's something wrong there. That child has obligations. Or, of course, vice versa. Think of the obligations a parent has to his child. Money and education and protection and food and clothing. And it lasts, of course, not just in childhood, but throughout life. There's a kind of obligation that a parent has to a child. And what does Jesus say? Unless your obligation to me is greater even than those, you are not worthy of me. Well, can you see why you almost feel debilitated by this? I mean, how could this take place? How could I possibly love you more than even these greatest loves of my life? I think what he's saying is this. God is God, after all. God is the good itself. God is the truth itself. God is justice itself. God is the sheer act of being itself. The one thing God cannot be, if he really is God, is peripheral to us. That's the point, Christians, I think. The one thing God cannot be is secondary. The minute you say, well, sure, I believe in God and honor God, but in a secondary way, it's not God that you're honoring. That's an idol. The minute you say, well, yeah, sure, God is important to me, but, you know, of course I love my children and my parents more intensely. Well, then it's not God. That's some kind of idol. God will not be, cannot be, set aside. He must be that which is loved above all things. So you say, okay, how do I do that? Short of becoming a Trappist monk and leaving everything behind. How do I do that? St. Augustine gives us a terrific insight here. Augustine says, I love other people and other things more truly when I love them for the sake of God. Let me say that again. I think it's a very important principle for Christians. I love other people and other things more fully, adequately, perfectly when I love them for the sake of God. Do I somehow abandon my love for parents, for children? No, but I situate those loves in the context of the highest love, which is that for God. When I don't, my love, even for parents and children, tends to become skewed, self-interested, manipulative. And we all know this. Oh, I'm a parent. I love my children. I give my life for them. Well, that love can very easily turn into manipulation, domination. I want to draw them into my world. I want to use them for my purposes. Now, when I love them, yes, with all my intensity, yes, but when I love them for the sake of God, now I know I don't love them for my sake. I don't love them for my purposes. But I love them so as to free them for their mission, to free them for their relationship with God. I love my work. I love my job. I love my social life, whatever it is. Good, good. But when I love it for its own sake, that tends to become self-absorbed, self-referential. But when I love my job for God's sake, now I see it as part of my mission from God. When I love, yes, even my social life for God's sake, now it takes on a whole new meaning. I'm detached from it. That's why the disciple has to be someone who loves God above all things. Otherwise, his discipleship will be inadequate. Now, what else does Jesus say in this speech to his apostles? Whoever does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And I know, Christians, we're reeling here a little bit from this speech, so I have to fear no one. I have to love Jesus above parents, above children. And now, just as I've kind of resigned myself to these two demands, now I've got to take up a cross, and if I don't, I'm not worthy of him? Yes, yes, yes. Notice, too, something here. He's not simply saying, accept sufferings as they come. Well, that would be the Stoic philosophy of the ancient world. You know, life is full of setbacks and hardships and sufferings, and when they come, you should accept them with a kind of equanimity. Well, that's not what Jesus is saying here, not simply that. He's saying, take up your cross. Not just accept sufferings as they come, but willingly, happily take on, carry a cross as Jesus carried a cross. Now, what did his cross mean? It was a suffering on behalf of others. Not just suffering. That happens to us all in different ways. But suffering on behalf of others. Listen now, bearing the burdens of the world. That's what the cross of Jesus meant. So what he's saying here is, if you are to be my disciple, you too must be eager, willing to bear the burdens of those around you. Take up your cross. Suffer on behalf of others. What's the sinner's vision of the good life? I get what I want. I work for my pleasure. I make sure I don't have a lot of burdens. I get other people to bear my burdens. And what's the lifestyle and attitude of the disciple? I want to take up my cross. That means my life is not about alleviating my own burdens, but rather bearing consciously and purposefully the burdens of those around me. When the disciple gets up in the morning, what he or she says is this: Lord, show me today how I can make lighter the burdens of others. I can help a lonely person bear his loneliness. I can help someone who is financially strapped to bear his burden more easily. I can help someone who's hungry, thirsty, homeless, lonely, afraid. That's the life of the disciple, willingly taking up the cross. How's it all summed up? This love beyond the love for parents and children, this taking up of the cross. If you cling to your life, you'll lose it. Let go of your life, you'll find it. Christians, there's the paradox at the heart of the whole gospel. The one way you know for sure your life is going to crumble in your hand is when you cling to it. When you open up your hand and let go of your life, let go of everything you've got on behalf of others, then you get it 30, 60, and 100-fold. That's why the life of discipleship, yes, it's full of demands. Yes, of course it is. But those demands are the key to joy and the key to ecstasy. Love Christ above all things. Take up your cross. Let go of your life. And your joy will be complete. And God bless. Peace be with you. Fear no one. That's what Jesus says to his disciples as he sends them out on their mission. Fear no one. Fear nothing. In John's Gospel, we hear that perfect love casts out all fear. What are you afraid of? What do you have to lose? Does it terrify you to think you might lose your wealth? You might lose your home? Your social status? Does it terrify you to think that you might lose your friends, the affection of others, your health, your power and your influence? What if someone told you you're going to lose your reputation and your good name? Would that terrify you? What if you heard from your doctor this week that you have 6 months to live? You're going to lose your life. Would that terrify you? Jesus says, fear no one. Fear nothing. You know, it's a commonplace of political theory that if you want to control somebody, you want to manipulate someone under you or around you, the key is learning their fears. Once you know what frightens somebody, then you can threaten them with the loss of it. Maybe there's someone around you that doesn't really care that much about money. They're not materialistic. But boy, they are very interested in their good name, their reputation. You want to control them? Threaten them with the loss of that. Or maybe someone isn't that concerned with money, but they're very interested in status, titles, power. Threaten them with the loss of that, and you can manipulate them and control them. You know the cynical adage that every man has his price? Well, it's based on this idea that we've all got something or someone that we're afraid of. Jesus is suggesting that we will not be adequate disciples as long as we are hampered by any such fears. You know, I've spoken to you before about my favorite movie, which is A Man for All Seasons. I've seen it probably 20 times. I first saw it when I was 16, and it just changed my life. And I've watched it pretty much at least once a year since then. I show it to my students here at the seminary on a regular basis. One thing I love about Man for All Seasons, of course, it's the story of St. Thomas More and his struggle with Henry VIII back in the 16th century. But one thing I love about it is it's a story of a man who can't be intimidated. And it threw everybody off. Here was a man who seemed not to have a price. The movie opens beautifully. It shows More at his stately home in Chelsea on the River Thames. He's there in the midst of a wonderful gathering of witty, intelligent, well-connected friends. There's all kinds of laughter and good cheer in this spacious mansion. He's surrounded by his family. The movie opens showing Thomas More at the height of his powers and moving at the highest levels of the society of his time. In short, here was a man who had a lot to lose. He then gets a summons right in the midst of his party, a summons from Cardinal Wolsey. He was the Lord Chancellor of England, you might say the Prime Minister, the chief officer of the king. And Wolsey is calling More on the spot to come and see him. So More dutifully leaves his gathering and he goes to see Wolsey. Wolsey is played beautifully by Orson Welles, who's kind of a man mountain. And there he is in his full cardinalatial red robes. And he's kind of glowering at More as he walks into his office. Now, if you're most people interested in status and position, honor, just that look from your superior would be enough to frighten you into submission. Uh-oh, I'm on the bad side of the one person I want to impress. More to the point, Wolsey has called More in the middle of the night. Undoubtedly, he's used this technique on lots of other people because he has adequately frightened them with it. He looks up at More and he says, "You opposed me in the council today, Thomas." More says, "Yes, Your Grace." Wolsey says, "Why?" More says, "I thought Your Grace was wrong." Wolsey's trying to frighten him, showing his displeasure. You didn't go along with me. Now, most people who have a price, most people who are afraid of losing status and position, would have been cowed into submission. More patiently gives him the honest answer. Well, Wolsey dies, and More himself becomes the Lord Chancellor of England. He's reached the very summit and pinnacle of the society of his time. But swirling around him is the great controversy concerning Henry VIII and his divorce. Do you remember Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn? But the Pope does not give him a dispensation. So Henry threatens to break off from Rome, found his own church, and sanction his divorce and remarriage. Well, with all of this, his Lord Chancellor, Thomas More, is in radical disagreement. And Henry VIII wants to bring him around. And so one fine evening, he calls on him. Now this in itself was a great honor. The king himself coming in person to your home to call on you. Well, the scene from the movie is terrific. Henry VIII is played by Robert Shaw. He's the man who about 10 years later played Captain Quint in the movie Jaws, do you remember? But in this movie, he's Henry VIII, and he's just stepped out of a Hans Holbein portrait. He has all the Renaissance finery on. And as he turn on the charm, he tells Thomas More that there's no one in his kingdom for whom he has greater respect, no one he would more readily honor than Thomas More. He plays music for him. He honors and flatters More's family. He takes him arm in arm on a walk while the others go ahead. Undoubtedly, this has worked well in the past. Now imagine, the king, in our setting, it would be like the president coming to your home, flattering you, spending time with you, walking arm in arm with you, and asking you for a special favor. How many of us, listen now, who are afraid of losing status, who want power and influence, how many of us would melt under the influence of that sun? Well, Henry brings up his issue with More. do you support me or not? Moore, with regret, but with honesty, tells him, no, I can't support you. At this point, the king bellows. He tried charm. That didn't work. Now he tries threats. At the top of his voice, he bellows at Thomas More. Now imagine you're someone who's afraid, and you have the king himself bellowing at you and threatening you. Almost all of us would cave in under that pressure. More holds fast. As the story progresses, the storm increases. The pressure increases upon More. Finally, he can't tolerate it, and he resigns as Lord Chancellor. He loses his money, his status, his office, the respect of most of his countrymen. At a very low ebb, he's called in by Master Cromwell, one of Henry VIII's henchmen. And Cromwell is trying to frighten him into subservience. And so he threatens, and he threatens, charging him with treason, threatening him with prison. And More shouts back at him, "Terrors for children, Master Secretary, not for me. I'm not someone who can be cowed by your games." Well, Cromwell does have him thrown in prison. He's now stripped not only of his status and office, but now his home, his family, his friends, all of it is taken from him. And in the filth and confinement of a prison cell, he sits. The movie comes to its conclusion with More's execution. His society had tried everything in every way to threaten and cow him into submission. And it finally comes to this. He's about to be beheaded. And he says, in a simple speech, "I die, His Majesty's good servant, but God's first." That's the motto, if you will, for the whole play. Listen, Christians, there was someone that Thomas More was afraid of. It wasn't Cromwell. It wasn't Wolsey. It wasn't Henry VIII himself. It wasn't the loss of his property. It was not the loss of his friends. It was not the loss of his home, not the loss of his family. He wasn't afraid, finally, of any of that. And that's why none of these powerful people could finally manipulate him. But he was afraid of something. And that was the loss of friendship with God. Fear no one, Jesus says. Now why? Because the only one you should fear is God. Listen to this now from Jesus' instruction to his disciples. Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul. There it is. Thomas More was a saintly disciple of the Lord because he was not afraid of those who can simply threaten or kill the body. And that means everything. Honor, money, friendship, connection, status. Those who can threaten those things, don't be afraid of them. Because you should be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul. You should fear the Lord, to use good Old Testament language. Can I say it more positively? When we have entered into friendship with God, we have now bound ourselves to the power that makes the whole cosmos, that transcends space and time, that transcends history, the power of being itself, that which is the truth in itself, that which is the good in itself, that which is justice in itself. When we have bound ourselves to that power, then we can look back at any and all of the goods of the world and see them in their proper perspective. None of those should be the center of my life. All of those can be dispensed with. I should not fear anyone who can merely threaten me with the loss of those things. Now, when I've reached that point, I am ready for discipleship. I am ready for mission. Listen to what Jesus says. You must be able to acknowledge me before others. What you have heard in privacy, you must be ready to proclaim from the housetops. Is discipleship a dangerous business? Yes, it always has been, it always will be. Speaking truth to a world that doesn't want to hear it. Those who are capable of it are those who have conquered their fear. Fear no one here below. Fear only God himself. Now you're ready for discipleship. God bless. Peace be with you. Friends, I want today to continue what we've done the last couple of weeks, which is look at this magnificent and strange and wonderful book of Revelation. I think I said a couple of weeks ago that when a novelist or a poet really wants to send the ultimate message, he'll put it in the final chapter or the final stanza, summing up what he wants to say. Well, the book of Revelation is God's last word to his people. It's the last book in the Bible. And in some ways you could say, even if the whole Bible were lost and only the book of Revelation remained, in some ways you'd have the whole message. Because in this book, we have symbolically expressed the heart of the Christian thing, the heart of the Christian idea. We saw last couple of weeks that the risen Christ is the key to history. He appears to St. John, luminous, with a great two-edged sword coming from his mouth. That means Christ is the light in which we understand things. His word is the sword which battles evil, the sword that rules history. We also saw last week that Jesus is the Lamb standing as though slain. Do you remember, as John looks into the throne room of heaven, he sees the scroll that stands for the meaning of history. The scroll is sealed by 7 seals. Who will open it? No one comes forward in heaven or on earth to open it. And then finally comes this Lamb, standing as though slain. This weak, powerless, and wounded animal, symbolizing Christ crucified, is in fact the key to history. He's the one who opens the scroll. Now, what I want to continue with today, and we'll just touch on a few highlights of this wonderful book. I'd encourage you to read it. It's not that long. It would take you just a couple of sittings probably. But read the book of Revelation. I'll just touch now on a few more highlights. He opens the seals of the scroll of history. And we quickly discover that this is one tough lamb. In some ways, it's the joke of the book. Here's this wounded, weak animal. He's the Lord of history? Well, watch what happens as he acts. As he opens each of the seals, apocalyptic signs, plagues, disasters unfold. You've heard, of course, of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They emerge as each of the first 4 seals is opened up. And these 4 horsemen, well, they rain destruction and plague and disaster on the earth. When the 6th seal is opened, for example, a great earthquake shakes the ground. The sun is blackened. The sky is rolled up like a scroll. I love this detail. People begged God to kill them, and they weren't able to die. That's how horrible these visitations were, unleashed by the Lamb. But then it goes on. After the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets are sounded. Well, these are the famous trumpets of doom. You know, so much of our common Christian vocabulary, from the pearly gates to people playing harps in heaven, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to this trumpet of doom, all that comes from the imagery of the book of Revelation. So the 7 trumpets are sounded by angels. What happens as they sound? Plagues like the 10 plagues of Egypt rain down. Burning of trees, hail, the turning of water to blood, the falling of the stars from the heavens, the poisoning of rivers and seas, and probably the most remarkable one, locusts who have the faces of human beings, long hair like women, John says, and then they're arrayed in the battle armament of soldiers. They come down upon the earth and they wreak havoc. But that's not it. You got the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets. They are followed by the 7 bowls of God's wrath. And these are now poured out on the earth. And in the same way, plagues, disasters, suffering rains down. Now, obviously all of these details are part of what makes this book so fascinating, why artists have loved it, why poets and preachers have returned to it. What do we make of this? Frightening. It is frightening. And here we are in the last book of the Bible. Maybe we're expecting a comforting word, and we get this train of disasters. Let me just say a couple things about it. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned to you that we shouldn't read this book simply as a reflection on events that happened in the first century. If that's the case, why are we reading it now? More to the point, we shouldn't simply read it as a prediction of what will happen at the end of the world. If that's the case, well, maybe it's true for people in 10,000 years, but not true for us. In some very basic way, this book has to reveal something that's permanently true, that's true for every generation of Christians, from the beginning to the end of time, and including our own generation. So how do we read these seals and trumpets and bowls, all this disaster? I think 2 things. The first Christians saw in the dying and rising of Jesus from the dead God's judgment on a sinful world. Now, I know that word has become very unfashionable. When I was coming of age, back in the 70s, we never talked about God's judgment. Somehow that was bad form, or it was frightening, or we've moved beyond that. Christians, you can't look at a chapter of any of the books of the Bible without coming across something like God's judgment. Now, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that God has fallen into an emotional snit, that God is angry at sin and so He's going to let us have it. Well, that's the way we operate. The justice or judgment of God in the Bible is God's desire to set things right. His passion, if you will, to set things right. God's a God of love. That means He wants us to be fully alive. That means He doesn't approve of a world that has fallen into sin. And therefore, from beginning to end of the Bible, you hear the language of God's judgment. Is God in the business of trying to transform a fallen world into a world of grace? Yes. Yes. Do we see it reflected here poetically and symbolically in the book of Revelation? I think we do. God's anger raining down on the earth, well, that's God's passion to set right a world that's predicated upon hatred and violence and injustice. Yes, God wants to destroy that world. That's His business. Now, how He does it, according to what timetable, we don't know. That's up to God. But we do know that permanently throughout the centuries, this is God's business, to change a fallen world into a world of grace. Let me look at it from just another angle. The first Christians also saw, in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that the old world is passing away. The world as we know it, when Jesus came back alive from the dead, they knew that the rules and assumptions and presumptions that we all go on, somehow they just don't work anymore. A world of disease, finitude, sickness, death, that is not the final word. That is not the ultimate world. That's not what God finally intends. What God finally intends is the resurrection and transformation of this whole world in Christ. Therefore, they began to say things. Listen to St. Paul, for example. The old world is passing away. Don't bank on it. Don't rest your life on it. You know, I've used the image before, and it's right out of the book of Revelation. This image of the earthquake. I've spoken to people in San Francisco who lived through some of those really intense earthquakes. The one I think in 1989 was the worst. And let's say that after the quake is over, you can go back to your house and it looks fine. Go back in the house, but then you find eventually that the foundations of it have been shaken. That house is now permanently dangerous. You've got to get out of it. You've got to build a new one. Even though it might look fine from the outside. So I think the Christians saw, the first Christians. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead is like a cosmic earthquake. The world might look pretty much the same after it's over, but in fact it's fundamentally changed. The foundations have been destroyed, and so now we have to orient our minds and our hearts to a new world. The world that Christ's resurrection has opened up to us. And I think that's the purpose, that's the meaning of this destruction rained upon the earth. The old world's ending. Get ready for the new one. Just a last image. I love this. It's from an early letter in the patristic period. The author said, "We ought to live as resident aliens here." I think I talked about that a few weeks ago. We live here in this world, but we're like resident aliens. Our real citizenship is elsewhere. The book of Revelation, I think, is telling that story. I think I have time just for one more image. Let me develop this. It's in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation, right near the middle of it. One of the most famous images from the New Testament. A great portent appears in the sky. So John the visionary is continuing to look at these visions. And he sees this portent. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She's pregnant, this woman. She's laboring to give birth. Remember? And then waiting to receive her child and devour it is a great dragon. So John sees this drama, this struggle. The woman about to give birth, the dragon about to devour the child. The child is born, and then at the last minute is snatched away to heaven, and the dragon is frustrated. What do we make of this? Well, Christian artists over the centuries have loved this scene. You can see it depicted all over the place. Paintings and sculpture and architecture. Who's this woman laboring to give birth? Well, in one sense, she's Israel. She's the Old Testament. She's all the prophets, all the seers, all the sages, all the history of the Old Testament. Laboring to give birth to the Messiah. See how the whole Old Testament tradition gives birth to the Messiah, God's deliverer. Now, we Catholics have a very strong sense that this woman is also Mary, Mary the Mother of God, who herself does symbolize the Old Testament. She sums it up in some way. She is Israel. And Mary, too, gives birth to the deliverer. Now, Christians, who is there waiting to oppose him? There's the dragon. And the book of Revelation is very clear. The dragon symbolizes Satan. Symbolizes all those powers of darkness, cosmic, earthly, and otherwise, that oppose the creative intentions of God. We have a battle on our hands. The Messiah has come, yes, through God's grace. This Messiah, the book tells us very clearly, will conquer, yes. But there is a battle going on. And Christians, you can see it throughout the New Testament. When Jesus appears on the scene, he is opposed by the demons, by the scribes, by the Pharisees, by the Roman establishment, by the Jewish religious establishment. He is opposed. So the book of Revelation is telling us, from the very beginning, in a cosmic sense, God's salvific intentions for the world are opposed. As this book unfolds, and next week I'll look at some of these battles, we're going to see all kinds of struggles and battles. In some ways, it's the story of our Christian lives. Don't be afraid. We're going to win. There's the final message. But in the meantime, we do have a battle on our hands. God bless you.